She signed the marriage papers without even looking at him. To her, he was just a homeless man her father forced her to marry, a quiet stranger with worn clothes, tired eyes, and no place in the life she had imagined for herself. No money, no status, no future. The kind of man people passed on the street without ever remembering his face. But what she didn't know, what no one in that room could have guessed from the way he sat there in silence, was that the man across from her was worth billions, the kind of wealth that builds companies, moves markets, and shapes lives without ever being seen. And everything that happened next was not an accident, not a coincidence, but a carefully unfolding sequence of decisions that began long before she ever picked up that pen. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Claire Whitmore, and by every measure that mattered in her world, she had done everything right. She was raised in a quiet, wealthy suburb outside Boston, educated in the best schools, taught to speak carefully, dress modestly, and never question the decisions made by her father, Richard Whitmore, a man whose influence stretched far beyond the walls of his own home. Richard was the kind of man people described as disciplined, strategic, and respected, but those who worked closely with him understood something else entirely. He believed control was the only thing that kept life from falling apart, and over the years, that belief shaped not just his business empire, but his daughter's future as well. Claire had grown up learning that love was secondary, that marriage was a decision, not a feeling, and that loyalty was expected, not earned. So when her father told her she would be getting married, he didn't ask. He informed her, the same way he would finalize a deal or close a negotiation. The explanation was brief, almost dismissive, as if the details didn't matter. The man's name was Daniel Hayes, a single father with a 5-year-old daughter, someone her father described as reliable and suitable. There was no mention of wealth, no discussion of background beyond the bare minimum, and certainly no reason given that made sense to Claire. The only thing that stood out was how little her father seemed concerned with appearances, which was unusual for a man who built his reputation on them. It didn't fit, and yet, Claire didn't argue. She had learned long ago that arguing only made things worse. The first time she saw Daniel was 3 weeks before the wedding, in the formal dining room of her father's estate. He arrived early, dressed in a simple jacket that had clearly seen better days, his posture relaxed in a way that felt out of place in a house where every movement was calculated. He didn't try to impress anyone, didn't speak unless spoken to, and when he did, his voice was steady, measured, almost too calm for someone in his position. Claire remembered noticing his eyes more than anything else. They didn't wander around the room the way most people's did when they were uncomfortable. They focused, observed, and seemed to take in more than they revealed. It unsettled her, though she couldn't explain why. In the days that followed, Claire tried to understand what her father saw in him, but every answer led to more questions. Daniel didn't behave like a man who needed anything, which made no sense given the story she had been told. He didn't seem grateful for the opportunity, didn't show the kind of desperation that usually came with financial struggle. If anything, there was a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself, as if he was entirely aware of something no one else in the room understood. It was subtle, easy to miss, but once she noticed it, she couldn't ignore it. The morning of the wedding arrived without ceremony, without celebration, just a quiet drive to the county clerk's office where everything would be made official. The building itself felt cold and impersonal, a place where decisions were recorded, not celebrated. Claire sat at the desk, pen in hand, her thoughts distant as the clerk explained the paperwork in a voice that barely registered. Across from her, Daniel remained silent, watching her with that same steady focus that had unsettled her from the beginning. She didn't look up. She didn't hesitate. She signed her name the way she had signed everything her father had ever put in front of her, quickly and without question. And yet, in that moment, something shifted, something so small it almost went unnoticed. It was in the way Daniel leaned back slightly after she finished, in the way his expression didn't change, not even a hint of relief or satisfaction crossing his face. It was as if the outcome had never been in doubt, as if this moment had been expected all along. Claire felt it then, a quiet, uncomfortable realization that she didn't understand the situation she had just stepped into. Not really. Because if this marriage had been arranged for convenience, for strategy, for control, then why did it feel like she was the only one who hadn't been fully informed? And that leads to a question no one in that room was asking. A question that would change everything Claire believed about the man she had just married. Why would a billionaire agree to this? Who was this man, really? The one sitting across from Claire Whitmore with a quiet composure that didn't match the story she had been told. A man introduced to her as Daniel Hayes, a struggling single father with nothing to offer except a simple, modest life she had never asked for and never imagined accepting, yet somehow carrying himself with a level of certainty that didn't belong to someone in his position, a certainty that made his silence feel deliberate rather than uncertain, controlled, rather than hesitant. And why would Richard Whitmore, a man who built his entire reputation on precision, power, and calculated decisions, arrange something like this without explanation, without even attempting to justify it in a way that aligned with everything he had spent decades establishing? Because this wasn't just unusual, it was inconsistent, and men like Richard did not tolerate inconsistencies, especially not in matters as visible and permanent as his daughter's marriage. The more Claire replayed the events in her mind, the less sense they made, because nothing about Daniel Hayes aligned with the version of him she had been given, not the way he spoke, not the way he observed the room, and certainly not the way others reacted around him when they thought no one was paying attention. Those brief moments when conversations shifted tone, when a passing glance lingered a second too long, when someone seemed to recognize something they couldn't quite place, and then quickly looked away as if it was safer not to ask questions. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there, and once Claire noticed it, she couldn't unsee it, couldn't return to the comfort of believing this was simply an arrangement made for convenience or obligation. And then there was the question that lingered beneath everything else, the one that didn't have an easy answer and didn't fit into any explanation her father had ever given her about how the world worked. What exactly was Daniel Hayes hiding from everyone? And more importantly, why did it feel like he wasn't the only one keeping secrets? Because if there was one thing Claire understood about her father, it was that he never moved without a reason, never placed a piece on the board unless he already knew the outcome he was working toward, which meant this marriage wasn't random, it wasn't impulsive, and it certainly wasn't a mistake. Nothing about this was what it seemed, and the deeper Claire allowed herself to think about it, the more she realized that the life she believed she was stepping into might not belong to her at all, but to a plan that had been set in motion long before she ever had a chance to question it. Claire Whitmore had lived a life most people would have envied, the kind of life built on security, structure, and quiet privilege, where every opportunity was already within reach and every decision had been carefully shaped long before she ever had to make it. Growing up in a home where expectations were clear and emotions were measured, where success was not celebrated but assumed, and where questioning authority was never encouraged. From the outside, it looked like she had everything: education, stability, influence, a future already mapped out with precision. But beneath that polished surface was something far less visible, a quiet absence of control that had followed her for as long as she could remember, a life where choices were presented as obligations and freedom existed more as an idea than a reality. She had learned to adapt to that system, to move within it without resistance, to accept decisions without asking why, because in her world, compliance wasn't just expected, it was rewarded, and over time, that became the only way she knew how to exist. Daniel Hayes, on the other hand, did not fit into that world in any way that made sense, not in appearance, not in behavior, and certainly not in presence. He was introduced as a man with very little, someone who had struggled, someone who had lost more than he had gained, a single father navigating a life that most people would find difficult to manage. Yet there was nothing about him that suggested instability or uncertainty. He was quiet, but not withdrawn, observant, but not intrusive, and in every situation Claire had seen him in, he carried himself with a level of calm that didn't belong to someone trying to survive day to day. It was the kind of composure that came from understanding situations before they unfolded, from knowing more than he allowed others to see, and that was what made him difficult to place. He didn't react the way people expected him to, didn't seek approval, didn't appear intimidated, and most noticeably, didn't behave like a man with nothing to lose. If anything, There was a quiet assurance in the way he moved, a sense that he was exactly where he intended to be, as if every moment leading up to this had already been considered. He didn't act like a man who had been given an opportunity. He acted like a man who had chosen one.
And then there was Richard Whitmore, a man whose entire life had been built on decisions that carried weight, consequences, and long-term outcomes. Someone who didn't leave important matters to chance, and certainly didn't involve his family in anything that hadn't been fully calculated. To understand Claire's situation, you had to understand him, because nothing in her life happened without passing through his judgment first. He was strategic in a way that extended beyond business. Someone who viewed relationships as extensions of influence and commitments as tools for maintaining control. And over the years, that approach had shaped not only his success, but the environment Claire had grown up in. He did not explain himself unless it served a purpose, did not justify his choices unless there was something to gain. And when he arranged this marriage, he offered no explanation at all, which in itself was an explanation. Because men like Richard Whitmore don't make random decisions, they don't act without intention, and they certainly don't place their daughter into a situation that doesn't serve a larger purpose, even if that purpose isn't immediately visible. As the days passed and the reality of the marriage began to settle in, Claire found herself revisiting every interaction, every detail, every moment that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt like part of something larger, something she couldn't quite define but could no longer ignore. There was a pattern emerging, subtle but consistent, a sense that she was missing pieces of a story that everyone else seemed to understand at least partially, and the more she tried to make sense of it, the clearer it became that this wasn't simply a matter of misunderstanding or miscommunication. This was something deliberate, something constructed with care, and she was only just beginning to realize how little she actually knew about the situation she had been placed in. She thought she understood the deal, thought she had accepted the terms as they were presented, but the truth was far more complicated than she had allowed herself to consider, and whether she was ready for it or not, that truth was already beginning to surface. She thought she understood the deal. She was wrong. The marriage itself was over in less than 20 minutes, reduced to signatures, formalities, and a quiet exchange of words that carried no emotion, no hesitation, and no sense of connection between the two people involved. Claire Whitmore sat upright, composed as she had always been taught, her expression neutral as the clerk finalized the documents, while Daniel Hayes remained across from her, calm and unreadable, as if the weight of the moment meant something entirely different to him than it did to everyone else in the room. There were no vows spoken beyond what was required, no lingering glances, no attempt to acknowledge what this union was supposed to represent. It was efficient, deliberate, and unmistakably transactional, more like the closing of a deal than the beginning of a marriage, and when it was done, nothing about the atmosphere suggested that anything meaningful had just taken place. But it was in the moments immediately after, in the details most people would overlook, that something began to shift, something subtle enough to pass unnoticed unless you were paying close attention. Daniel's eyes moved across the room with quiet precision, not aimlessly, but with purpose, as if he were cataloging everything around him, from the placement of documents on the desk to the positioning of the staff members standing near the door. It wasn't curiosity, and it wasn't nervousness. It was awareness, controlled and deliberate, the kind that suggested familiarity rather than discomfort. Claire noticed it when he briefly glanced at the clerk's wristwatch, a glance so quick it could have been accidental, except for the way his expression changed, just slightly, as if he had confirmed something he already suspected. It didn't make sense, and yet it stood out. Then there was the way the staff interacted with him, not openly, not in any way that would draw attention, but in small, almost imperceptible shifts in behavior. A man near the entrance straightened his posture the moment Daniel stood up. Another hesitated for half a second before speaking, as if choosing his words more carefully than necessary. These were not gestures of respect in the traditional sense, but they weren't dismissive either. They existed somewhere in between, subtle acknowledgments that carried meaning without explanation. Claire couldn't place it at first, couldn't fully understand why it felt unusual, but the more she observed, the more it became clear that Daniel was not being treated the way someone in his supposed position typically would be. The tension sharpened when one of the attendants, a middle-aged man who had been organizing documents near the counter, looked directly at Daniel and froze, just for a moment, his expression shifting from routine focus to something closer to recognition. It was brief, almost gone as soon as it appeared, but it was there, unmistakable and real. His eyes lingered a fraction longer than they should have, his posture tightening before he quickly looked away and resumed his work as if nothing had happened. Daniel noticed it too. Claire could tell by the way his gaze held steady for just a second longer, not reacting, not confronting, but acknowledging it in a way that suggested it wasn't unexpected. No words were exchanged, no questions asked, but the moment lingered in the air, unresolved and heavy with implication. That's when the first crack appeared in the story, because up until that point, everything had followed the narrative Claire had been given, a simple arrangement, a controlled decision, a predictable outcome. But that moment didn't fit, and once something doesn't fit, it becomes impossible to ignore. As they stepped out of the building and into the quiet afternoon, the world around them continuing as if nothing had changed, Claire felt something she hadn't felt before, not fear, not confusion, but a growing awareness that she was standing at the edge of something she didn't understand. Because this wasn't just a man stepping into a life he didn't belong to. This was someone who had been in rooms like this before, someone who moved through them without hesitation, without uncertainty, as if he knew exactly how they worked and what they concealed. And that realization brought with it a question she could no longer push aside. Because this wasn't his first time in a room like this. In the days that followed, the quiet routine Claire Whitmore expected never fully settled into place, replaced instead by a series of moments that felt disconnected at first, but slowly began to form a pattern she couldn't ignore. It started with the phone calls, brief and deliberate, always taken in private, always ending with the same calm expression Daniel Hayes carried into every room, giving nothing away, offering no explanation, and leaving behind only silence where there should have been answers. He never raised his voice, never sounded pressured or uncertain, and yet there was a weight to those conversations, something measured in the pauses, in the way he listened more than he spoke, as if every word on the other end mattered more than anything happening around him. Claire noticed how consistent it was, how controlled, and how it didn't align with the life he was supposed to be living. Then there were the people, the ones who appeared without introduction and disappeared just as quietly. Individuals who seemed to take an interest in Daniel without ever approaching him directly, their presence lingering just long enough to be noticed before blending back into the background. Claire caught glimpses of them more than once, a figure standing across the street for too long, a car parked in the same place at different times of day, a man in a cafe who seemed more focused on observing than participating. None of it was obvious enough to confirm, but it was consistent enough to raise questions, and the more she paid attention, the harder it became to dismiss. This wasn't coincidence, and it certainly wasn't random. What unsettled her most, however, were the inconsistencies that began to surface in ways she couldn't easily explain. A receipt left on the counter that didn't match the lifestyle he was supposed to have. A brief glimpse of a bank notification that suggested numbers far beyond what anyone had described to her. Small details that didn't belong in the same narrative she had been given. Each one on its own could have been ignored, rationalized, explained away, but together, they created something far more difficult to dismiss, a quiet contradiction that grew stronger with every passing day. Claire found herself going back over everything she thought she knew, trying to align the man in front of her with the version she had been told to accept, but the two refused to match. Eventually, the questions she had been holding back could no longer stay unspoken, and one evening, in the stillness of a room that felt too quiet for the weight of what she was about to ask, she finally looked at him directly and said the words that had been building for days, her voice steady but edged with something deeper, something searching for clarity more than confrontation. "Who are you really?" Daniel didn't react the way she expected, didn't hesitate or deflect in the way someone caught off guard might, but instead met her gaze with the same calm composure that had defined every interaction they'd had so far. His answer came without urgency, without tension, delivered in a tone so even it almost felt detached. "Does it matter?"
That response didn't resolve anything. If anything, it deepened the uncertainty, because it wasn't the answer of someone trying to hide something out of fear. It was the response of someone who didn't feel the need to explain at all. And that distinction changed everything. It forced Claire to consider possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to entertain before. possibilities that moved beyond simple misunderstandings into something far more complicated. There were moments when his behavior suggested experience, knowledge, and control that didn't align with the image of a struggling man, and other moments when his silence felt calculated, as if revealing the truth too early would disrupt something already in motion. Naturally, her mind began to search for explanations, trying to place him into categories that made sense, even if they were uncomfortable. Could he be involved in something illegal, someone operating outside the boundaries of what she understood, using this marriage as a cover or a way in? Or perhaps something less dangerous, but equally deceptive, a man skilled at presenting himself in ways that served a purpose, someone who had constructed a version of his life that wasn't entirely real. There were even moments, brief but persistent, where she wondered if he might be something else entirely, someone whose intentions were not yet clear, whose presence in her life was tied to reasons she hadn't yet uncovered. None of these possibilities felt complete, but each one added to the growing sense that she was dealing with something far beyond what she had initially believed. And as those thoughts settled into place, as the questions continued to build without resolution, Claire began to understand something she hadn't fully grasped before, something that shifted the entire foundation of what she thought this marriage was. She started to realize that this wasn't about adapting to a life she didn't choose or accepting circumstances she couldn't control. It was about uncovering a truth that had been deliberately kept just out of reach, a truth that was beginning to reveal itself in fragments, each one raising more questions than it answered. She started to realize that she hadn't married a poor man, not in any sense that mattered. She had married a mystery. By the end of the second week, Claire Whitmore had stopped trying to ignore the inconsistencies and started quietly looking for answers, not in a reckless way, not in a way that would draw attention, but with the same careful discipline she had learned growing up under her father's watch, where every action was measured and every decision carried weight. It wasn't suspicion alone that pushed her forward. It was the growing realization that whatever truth existed behind Daniel Hayes was not going to reveal itself on its own. And if she continued to wait, she would remain exactly where she was, surrounded by fragments of a story that refused to come together. The opportunity came in a moment that seemed ordinary at first, a brief lapse in routine when Daniel stepped out unexpectedly, leaving behind a space that felt unusually still, as if something important had just shifted without announcing itself. It was subtle, almost accidental, the way her attention moved across the room, not searching for anything specific, but aware enough to notice what didn't belong. On the edge of a table, partially obscured beneath a folded document, was something that shouldn't have been there, something that didn't align with the life she had been told he lived. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a standard financial statement, the kind of document most people would overlook without a second thought. But there was something about the formatting, the structure, the level of detail that made her pause. Claire hesitated, not out of fear, but out of the understanding that once she looked closer, once she allowed herself to see what was there, she wouldn't be able to return to the uncertainty that had protected her from the truth. When she finally picked it up, her eyes moved slowly across the page, taking in each line with increasing focus, as if her mind needed time to process what it was seeing before it could fully understand it. The numbers were the first thing that stood out, not just large, but structured in a way that suggested scale far beyond personal savings or ordinary income. Figures connected to accounts that carried names she didn't immediately recognize, but instinctively knew were significant. It wasn't just wealth, it was organized, layered, and deliberate, the kind of financial presence that belonged to someone operating at a level she had never associated with Daniel Hayes. For a moment, she questioned whether she was misreading it, whether there was some explanation that could make it fit into the narrative she had been given, but the longer she looked, the less possible that became. Her attention shifted to a detail near the top of the document, something small but impossible to ignore once it was seen clearly. A name, not Daniel Hayes, but something else entirely, something that carried a weight she couldn't immediately define but instinctively understood was real. It wasn't a nickname or a variation. It was a completely different identity, one that connected to everything she had been trying to make sense of without ever finding the missing piece. The realization didn't come all at once. It unfolded slowly, each second stretching longer than the last as her mind worked to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the evidence now in her hands. At that exact moment, something shifted in a way that could not be undone, a quiet but undeniable break between assumption and reality that left no room for doubt. And that's when everything changed, not because the truth had fully revealed itself, but because Claire Whitmore had finally crossed the point where uncertainty was no longer possible. The room felt different, heavier, as if the air itself had adjusted to the weight of what she had just discovered. And for the first time since the marriage had begun, she wasn't questioning whether something was wrong. She knew it was. She didn't move right away, didn't react in a way that would release the tension building inside her, but instead stood there in silence, the document still in her hands, her thoughts moving faster than her expression allowed. Every interaction, every unanswered question, every moment that had felt slightly out of place now returned with new meaning, aligning in ways that made the truth impossible to ignore. The calmness in his voice, the confidence in his silence, the way others reacted around him, none of it had been accidental, none of it had been misunderstood. It had all been part of something she was only now beginning to see clearly. And as she stood there, holding the evidence that confirmed everything she hadn't yet fully accepted, one realization settled deeper than all the others, steady and undeniable, reshaping everything she thought she understood about the man she had married. Daniel Hayes was not who he said he was, and whatever name he had been living under, whatever life he had presented to the world, it was only a fraction of something much larger, something far more controlled and intentional than she had ever imagined. Claire Whitmore didn't need more time to understand what she was looking at, because the truth was no longer hidden behind small inconsistencies or subtle details. It was right there in front of her, structured in numbers, names, and records that carried a level of authority no explanation could dismiss. The document in her hands wasn't just proof of wealth, it was proof of influence, of reach, of a life that extended far beyond anything Daniel Hayes had allowed her to see. And as her mind began to process the scale of it, one reality became impossible to deny. The man she thought had nothing owned more than she could ever imagine, not just in terms of money, but in terms of power, connections, and control over systems she had only ever observed from a distance. This wasn't hidden savings or quiet success. This was something established, something known in the right circles, something that required intention to conceal. When Daniel returned, there was no immediate confrontation, no dramatic shift in tone, only a quiet awareness that passed between them the moment he stepped into the room and saw her standing there, the document no longer hidden, the silence between them no longer neutral. He didn't ask what she had found, didn't rush to explain or defend, because he already knew. His expression remained steady, but there was a subtle change, something almost imperceptible, as if a part of the distance he had maintained was no longer necessary. Claire looked at him differently now, not with confusion, but with clarity shaped by the weight of what she had uncovered. And for the first time, the question she asked didn't carry uncertainty. It carried understanding. Why? Daniel held her gaze for a moment before responding, not with hesitation, but with the same controlled tone that had defined everything about him from the beginning. Except now it carried something more direct, something that suggested this was no longer a situation that required concealment. He explained it without unnecessary detail, but with enough truth to make the situation unmistakably clear. This marriage had never been random, never been a simple arrangement orchestrated by her father for reasons of convenience or obligation. It had been intentional from the start, designed with a purpose that extended beyond what Claire had been told, and at the center of that purpose was Richard Whitmore. The pieces began to align in a way that made the past weeks feel less like confusion and more like preparation. Daniel wasn't just hiding his identity. He had been observing, assessing, understanding the environment he had stepped into, and the role he had taken on wasn't passive. It was active, deliberate, and directed. He had entered her life under specific conditions, not because he needed anything from her, but because there was something about her father's world that required a closer look, something that couldn't be approached directly without raising suspicion. The marriage had provided that access, that proximity, a way to move within a system that was otherwise closed to outsiders. But there was another layer, one Claire hadn't expected, one that shifted the situation beyond strategy and into something more personal. It wasn't just about investigation or access. It was also about her. Daniel had been given a version of who Claire Whitmore was, a description shaped by her father's influence, by reputation, by assumptions, and he hadn't accepted it without question. This arrangement had been an opportunity to see for himself, to understand whether she was simply a product of that environment or something more independent, something capable of seeing beyond the control that had defined her life. In that sense, the marriage had been a test, not in a manipulative way, but in a way that allowed truth to reveal itself over time, without pressure, without forced conclusions. At the same time, there was a quieter implication beneath everything he said, something he didn't need to fully explain for Claire to understand. Her father's involvement in this arrangement had not been as straightforward as she had believed. Richard Whitmore had his own reasons, his own objectives, and while he had initiated the situation, he had not controlled every aspect of it. There were forces at play that extended beyond a single decision, intersecting in ways that neither side had fully anticipated. And somewhere within that intersection was the reason Daniel Hayes, or whatever his real name truly was, had chosen to step into her life the way he did. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of realization, of everything Claire had just learned, reshaping her understanding of the past, the present, and the future she had unknowingly stepped into. She had entered this marriage believing it was a limitation, a loss of control, a decision made for her without consideration. But now it was clear that it had been something far more complex, something built on layers of intention she was only beginning to uncover. And as she stood there, facing the man she thought she had understood, one truth settled in with quiet certainty. Nothing about this had been simple, and whatever came next would depend not on what she had been told, but on what she chose to do with what she now knew. For a long moment, Claire Whitmore said nothing, not because she didn't have questions, but because the answers she had just received had already changed more than she was prepared to confront all at once. The shock came first, sharp and immediate, not just from the truth about Daniel Hayes, but from the realization that everything she had accepted without question had been built on incomplete information, shaped by decisions made around her rather than with her. It wasn't just about who he was. It was about what that meant for everything else, for her father, for the life she thought she understood, for the role she had been placed into without ever seeing the full picture. And then, almost as quickly, that shock gave way to something quieter, something heavier, a sense of guilt that settled in as she began to reflect on how she had treated him from the very beginning, how easily she had reduced him to a version of himself that required no effort to understand, no reason to question, no need to look deeper. But that wasn't the strangest part, because as those thoughts took shape, Claire began to recognize something even more unsettling, not about Daniel, but about herself, about how naturally she had accepted a narrative that fit her expectations, how quickly she had dismissed the possibility that there might be more beneath the surface simply because it hadn't been presented to her that way. What happened next shocked her, not in the sense of a sudden event, but in the way her perspective began to shift, slowly but completely, forcing her to reconsider not just the past few weeks, but the patterns that had defined her entire life. She had always believed she was observing the world clearly, making sense of it based on what she saw and what she was told, but now it was clear that what she saw had always been filtered, shaped by assumptions she had never taken the time to question. Daniel Hayes remained where he was, watching her not with expectation, not with pressure, but with a kind of patience that suggested he understood exactly what she was processing, as if he had anticipated this moment long before it arrived. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to defend himself or to justify what had been done, but to complete the truth in a way that didn't require explanation beyond what was necessary. There were details he could have shared, deeper layers to everything she had uncovered, but he chose not to, not because they didn't matter, but because they were no longer the point. What mattered was what Claire understood now, what she chose to do with that understanding, and whether she was willing to step outside the structure that had defined her life for so long. There was a finality to the moment that didn't need to be announced, something unspoken but clear in the way Daniel shifted his posture slightly, as if preparing to leave the space they had both been standing in, not out of avoidance, but out of respect for the choice that now belonged entirely to her. He had entered her life for reasons that had been carefully considered, reasons that extended beyond what she had initially believed, but he was not there to control how it ended. That had never been his role. For the first time since this began, Claire Whitmore was not being directed, not being guided, not being positioned within a decision made by someone else. She was being left with the truth and the freedom to decide what came next. And as she stood there, watching him with a clarity she hadn't possessed before, one realization settled in, steady and undeniable, reshaping everything she thought she understood about people, about judgment, about the quiet assumptions that often go unchallenged. Sometimes, the people we underestimate are the ones who understand everything, not because they reveal it openly, but because they don't need to. They move through situations with a level of awareness that doesn't rely on appearances, and in doing so, they expose the limits of how others choose to see the world. The question that remained wasn't about Daniel Hayes, not anymore, and it wasn't about the decisions her father had made or the reasons behind them. It was about Claire Whitmore, about what she would do with the truth now that she had it, about whether she would return to the life she had always known or step into something uncertain but entirely her own. If you were in her position, faced with everything she had just discovered, would you have stayed or would you have walked away?